Welcome back to the Dean Obeidallah Show. Right now, very happy to have Congressman Hank Johnson, a Democrat representing the 4th Congressional District in Georgia, a member of the Judiciary Committee, as well as Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and a tireless activist for ethics, finally coming to the Supreme Court, and it continues again with Justice Alito. So, Congressman Johnson, nice to see you, my friend. Thanks for being on.
Great to be with you, Dean. It just seems to keep building. I mean, it's like a snowball going downhill towards hell. It continues to gather momentum, and it's melting also. But for some reason, although it's melting, it seems to be getting larger.
It's a race to see who is the worst, I guess, on the justices here, and they all have their own different things of the GOP appointed one. But obviously, the news now is Justice Alito, and that we learned from the reporting that shortly after January 6th, on his house, they were flying an upside-down flag, which had become a symbol of Stop the Steal. It's also known as American Distress. And then another flag at their summer home associated with insurrectionists and Christian nationalists. And there's a lot of stories, a lot of dog ate my homework, or my wife put the flag up, that kind of stuff going on here. What was before we get to the idea of what Alito said in response to the request for recusal, what was your reaction when you just heard these two stories?
Well, as soon as I heard about the inverted flag, I knew that we needed to get a letter together to demand that Alito recuse himself from these two very consequential cases that are pending before the court, Trump v. United States and also Fisher versus United States, one having to do with immunity, presidential immunity, and the other having to do pretty much with immunity for prosecuting January 6th insurrectionists for obstruction, whether or not they would be immunized against that charge. And so very important consequential cases pending before the court at this time. And here we have a Supreme Court justice just days after the insurrection and a few days before Joe Biden takes office, flying a flag, flying a United States flag, an inverted United States flag from his personal residence, proudly flapping in the breeze of the January chill out there, and clear blue skies, flag waving proudly. And that is an indication of what the man was thinking. But of course, he put it on his wife. He said that I didn't even know the flag was up there. It was her flag. She put it up. I didn't know it was out there. And by the way, when I found out that it was out there, she wouldn't let me take it down. And, the explanation did not make sense. And we demanded that he recuse himself. And then a couple of days later, another story and another photo comes out with the Appeal to Heaven flag flying from his vacation home up in New Jersey. And he didn't say anything about how that occurred.
Right.
Or maybe about a week or so before he finally came up with his story. Again, it was my wife. I didn't know anything about it, and she wouldn't let me take it down. But she didn't know what that flag meant either. And so those explanations taken together just do not hold a lot of water. Not a lot of people believe that. And so Justice Alito has responded now to our two letters, and he has said that unbiased and reasonable people would agree with him and his two versions of why these flags were flying over his property. And because reasonable and unbiased people who don't have an ideological or political motive would agree with his explanations and accept them, then he has no obligation to recuse himself. And that just flies in the face of what is reasonable and unbiased.
So from your point of view, Congressman, and other Democrats who joined the letter, these flags, they raise concerns, just so people understand objectively, that the appearance of bias, the appearance, it's not impropriety as much as the appearance of bias, that he is favoring the January 6th attackers and should not then rule on any case involving January 6th, be it the Trump case or the January 6th, actually the attackers were charged with obstructing. Is that fair?
That is exactly correct. The appearance is there. Whether or not he wants to believe it or not, it is there. Most reasonable and unbiased people realize that his association with the case taints the case, because it appears that he is biased towards Trump and towards the insurrectionists on January 6th. And so therefore he has no business deciding this case. And if he does, then he further diminishes public trust and confidence in the court, which is already at an all-time low.
Very much so. I'm talking to Congressman Hank Johnson. In Justice Alito's letter back to you, and I think he wrote 2 letters, he was very prolific. He said, my wife is a private citizen and possesses the same First Amendment right as every other American. She makes her own decisions, and I've always respected her right to do so. And obviously, what jumps out is the irony of this man writing the opinion to take women's fundamental right away to control reproductive freedom, and not respecting their right to make their own decision. But when it comes to flags, he's fine with women making their own decision. But when it comes to their health care and reproductive freedom, he has no problem stripping their reproductive freedom.
Well, he is okay with his wife having control over what flags are flown in his household, and she is the shot caller when it comes to flags. But ironically for her, while Justice Alito respects her right to freedom of speech and upholds it, she herself, Mrs. Alito, doesn't appreciate the free speech rights that her neighbors have, and took issue with their signs in their yard. And so, she and he, and also Jenny Thomas and Clarence Thomas, appear to be cut from the same cloth. They have privileges and they have rights that they respect for each other. But outside of that small circle, nobody else has rights. And of course, women in general, you don't have the right to bodily autonomy. You don't have the right to determine whether or not you have reproductive freedom or not. And it is quite ironic and it's sickening, the entitlement and the arrogance that is on display with Justice Alito, his wife, and also Justice Thomas and his wife.
And you're a former judge. We're both lawyers. Neither of us practice right now, which is good. But there are certain things that don't really pass the common sense smell test. The excuse given by Justice Alito about his wife is that she had an argument with a neighbor, so she put a flag that America's under distress in response. I've had some disputes with friends and people. I've never raised the flag that America is under distress because my neighbor and I don't agree on how high the tree should be or the shrub should be, or whatever it might be, even if it's a political dispute. So it really flies in the face of common sense that that's the reason. And I can't say that's 100% not the reason because I wasn't there, but it doesn't seem to be the reason, especially now the New York Times reporting that the argument that Justice Alito's wife had with the neighbor happened in mid-February, and this flag went up, days after January 6th. There's just a whole lot of lying going on. It seems like I hate to say lie because I can't get into their brain and I'm trying to be as fair as possible here, but it seems like it's a little hard to believe this. Let me put it that way.
Well, I tell you, when the neighbors documented what was going on as it occurred with emails and also with a report to the Fairfax County Police Department, it's kind of hard to argue which evidence is superior. The memory of Justice Alito and his secondhand explanations on behalf of his lovely wife, or the documentation that doesn't match Justice Alito's timeline
Hmm.
is just an implausible explanation that doesn't jive with known facts. And so therefore, I think even though you are reluctant to conclude that Justice Alito is telling a fib, let me be kind about it. Even though you're nice about it, others would come straight out and say that this sounds like he's lying. And it sounds like he's lying not once, but twice, because it took him so long to come up with his explanation for the second flag. I mean, he got caught with his hand in the cookie jar again. And you just can't make this stuff up. And so it surprised him that he
Hmm.
had been outed. And it took him a few days to come up with another explanation. He knew he had to make one. I'm not sure whether or not Chief Justice Roberts leaned on him to actually respond, or whether or not he figured in his own mind that he needed to respond. But whichever way it went, his explanation just doesn't add up.
And that I agree with it. And it's not that I'm defending Alito by saying he's not a liar. You know, it could be misremembering. There could be a lot of other things going on, but it's not accurate. I mean, it doesn't pass the common sense test that you would say to a jury, just apply common sense. It doesn't apply. And you're going to put a flag up at your summer home and you really don't know what it means. I mean, come on. No one's doing that. If I fly a New York Mets flag, I know exactly what it means. I like the New York Mets. And I also like suffering a lot because as a Met fan, there's a great deal of suffering. There's different things. I'm chatting with Congressman Hank Johnson. So Congressman, we've talked so many times before about your legislation to bring ethics laws to the Supreme Court, but now you've done something new, the Court Reform Now Task Force. Can you share a little bit about what that's about and what the mandate of that task force is?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question, Dean. There are a lot of members of Congress who have not gotten to the point where they realize that we need reforms
Mhm.
to our United States Supreme Court because it is now off track and off the rails, and it is now legislating from the bench. Its fits of judicial activism has now turned into a mode of conduct, and they activate, or they are able to do whatever they want to do, regardless of precedent, regardless of legislative intent, regardless of executive authority. They are moving forward, doing setting policies that must be followed by the other two branches of government. They have disrupted the delicate system of checks and balances that is at the heart of our democratic structure, and they are now putting our democracy at risk for substantial numbers of Americans. And so many of my colleagues are not aware of how, over the last 50 years, we have reached this critical juncture that calls out for the need of Supreme Court reform. And so we formed the task force to educate and enlighten our colleagues as well as other members of the public so that we can generate support for passage of three particular pieces of legislation. The Supreme Court Ethics, Recusal, and Transparency Act, also known as the CERT Act, which would mandate a code of conduct that the justices on the court must follow, and also put in place a mechanism for enforcing those rules of conduct. We don't have such a mechanism at this point, and so we need to pass that legislation. Also, the Term Act, the Supreme Court Tenure Establishment and Retirement Act, which would impose 18-year term limits on Supreme Court justices. And in that way, we could keep the court immunized from the kind of systemic corruption that has taken root as a result of lifetime tenure with no accountability by these justices. They feel like they can do whatever they want to do. And then last but not least, the Judiciary Act of 2023, which would add seats to the United States Supreme Court and actually rebalance it because it's been packed with right-wing extremist ideologues, and we can't afford to go 10, 15, 20 years with these guys in place doing whatever they want to do. So that's why we established that task force is to push for passage of those three pieces of legislation.
They are vitally needed. And you mentioned earlier the lack of confidence in our Supreme Court. Now, it is dangerous. When you lose confidence in one of the three branches, it really chips away at confidence in the entire Constitution. Do you think, have you talked to the Biden administration, or maybe it's part of the campaign at this point, that to make it part of the campaign? Because I can tell you, Supreme Court reform gets a lot of passion from listeners to my show when we talk about this, because they see the Supreme Court is nothing more than an arm of the GOP. It's no longer a court like when we were growing up, and it's got to be corrected. Plus the ethics violations of especially Thomas and now Alito as well. So I think this is ripe for a campaign issue to really motivate people on our base.
Well, I think we are seeking to educate and activate folks in all three branches of government, not just the legislative branch, but the executive branch, and indeed lower court judges, lower court federal judges have a say in this. They are the ones who work through the judicial conference to set policies for the courts in general. And that body, which is led by the Chief Justice, is still a body made up of very senior, important federal judges across the country on all levels of the court who come together and set policy. And so we want to get that group in tune with the need for reform of the court. So not just the Biden administration, but also the judicial branch, but most importantly, the legislative branch. And I think because, as you say, this issue of court reform is growing. You're hearing about it from your listeners.
Yes.
And I appreciate you for focusing on that issue also. And then, that word gets to legislators and inspires them to not be as conservative as we tend to become when we get into office. We don't want to make big changes, and making changes to the Supreme Court is a big change, but it's a necessary change and something that we must do. And the sooner we can get to it, the better off we will all be.
And we can even tell the more traditionalist, John Adams changed the size of the Supreme Court, the second president, and then Thomas Jefferson changed it again, the third president. So this is what we do as presidents. When they did that in the early days, they did it for political reasons, to be blunt. We're just trying to bring the judiciary back to the judiciary. We're just trying to bring the Supreme Court to becoming a court again. People should have confidence in it. And it doesn't mean Democratic controlled. It means an institution that is independent, that is judiciary, that people can believe is not making political decisions, but judicial. And there was a Quinnipiac poll last year. Now we're up to nearly 7 in 10 voters think the court is mainly motivated by politics. That's not healthy. That is not healthy for the checks and balances that it's supposed to be. And I'm chatting with Congressman Hank Johnson. To shift gears the last couple of minutes here, one thing I wanted to touch on was, and you've been such a great advocate for Palestinian humanity for years, not just now in Gaza, and being a Palestinian heritage. Just want to say thank you for that. You know, I saw Speaker Mike Johnson again is set on inviting Benjamin Netanyahu to speak to Congress, which is an honor. You're celebrating someone who we've seen a loss of life, unlike in any other conflict. In Rafah, just in the last few days, children being burned alive. How could the United States of America, any branch, and I know it's Republicans control it, any body, invite this man to celebrate him in the midst of what we're seeing now, which are, by the words of people like Senator Van Hollen, Senator Sanders, actually war crimes going on, or at least violation of international law?
Yeah, it's thoroughly disappointing how far we have sunk, that we would celebrate a war criminal by inviting him to join or to address a joint session of Congress. Why would we do that at the time of the height of the criminality that's taking place? It's very disturbing. The only explanation is just rank politics. The fact that folks are playing politics with the lives of people who live in a distant land, but yet they are people, they are our fellow human beings. They are being killed and maimed and starved to death. And, you know, no end in sight, despite the international community being united almost in total against what is happening over there, that is being directed by this guy that you're going to invite to address a joint session of Congress. It's just rank politics. It's uncaring. It's failure to care about what's going on with our fellow human beings. It's bad policy. It's inhumane. Whatever else you want, it's just wrong that we would invite this gentleman to address us. Why would I be one to sit there and listen to him?
I understand. And it's just part of the MAGA, to be blunt, their cruelty and their callousness. And it is just another example of it for all of us as we head in just less than 6 months to the election. So
by the way, Dean, that's an important point, because Benjamin Netanyahu is a Trump supporter.
Yes.
He was a Trump supporter in 2016. He was a Trump supporter in 2020. And today, 2024, he's seeking to influence the outcome of this election. And so he would love to come to Congress and undercut everything that this administration should be doing.
Yes. And we can hope for an evolution of policy. It looked like things were changing, now not. But the last thing I did want to touch on, because we are getting close to the election, how are things in Georgia looking for Democrats statewide? And of course, obviously, President Biden's reelection, that was a key state in his victory in 2020.
Well, this state continues to change. More and more people are moving to this state. They tend to be Black and brown. Mm-hmm. So, the state is darkening. Folks who have dark skin tend to be those who vote Democratic. Why? Not because they are on a plantation somewhere, but they're voting for the party that most reflects their aspirations, their interests, their needs. And so, and we have a high voter registration rate here in Georgia. And so, because when you get your driver's license, you can get registered to vote right then. And so people who are moving in and people who are already here, high registration rate. And so the numbers look good as far as November is concerned. What the challenge is to get out and motivate folks to actually get out and vote, and to vote in their interest, not voting for RFK Jr. as a protest. That's a vote for Trump. Certainly not voting for Trump, because what has he done for you other than make it less likely that you're going to be able to enjoy freedom and equality into perpetuity in this country. He's threatening that.
Yep.
And so we got to get you to get out and vote in your best interest. I think the chances of that happening are quite good, because our citizens are educated and they understand the difference between President Biden and a guy like Donald Trump. And so I feel good about it, even though we have these polls that tell us that Biden is in trouble in the Black community. I don't see it on the street. I see it in the polls that
right.
mainstream media talks about, but I don't see it on the street.
And I'm glad you're sharing that. And we had on earlier in the week, the NAACP had Derek Johnson on and talked about, but he did talk about there's a need for more outreach and enthusiasm will build in time, and that some people are just not following politics right now. We follow politics. Obviously, you're a member of Congress, but people who listen to the show, we follow politics all the time, off years, whatever. The average person's more this summer when the conventions happen and in the fall. And I think the polls will shift then as the stakes become clear. It's a choice between keeping a democratic republic or potentially going into a fascist or an authoritarian state. And that's what Donald Trump is pledging at his rallies, to liberate this nation from all of us. And he says liberate all the time. And I'm trying to get the corporate media to cover that more, because I think it's truly a dark, sinister message he's selling, and his supporters are listening to it. And we've got to get out there and vote big numbers. So, Congressman Johnson, it's always great seeing you. Thanks for spending some time with us here, and keep up the great work and fighting for ethics and bringing fairness, ethics, and sanity to the Supreme Court, because that's where we need it. We need people to have confidence in our courts.
Well, you're exactly right, Dean, and I appreciate your focus on this very important issue, as well as other issues that may not garner the same attention from mainstream media as you bring to the equation. And so we need to continue to have folks like you out here who are going deeper into the challenges that we face, and helping to educate the people so that it's the people who determine the future of this country. And we can do so by our inaction, or we can do so by our action. And when we hear from folks like you and your guests, it helps spring us into action. And so I'm a great optimist, with no reason for being that way other than just simply I'm a great optimist. And so I look forward to November and victory and better things happening for our nation.
I agree. Same thing. Have a great day, Congressman. Thanks for being on.
Thank you, sir.
Take care.
I appreciate it.